There is a version of World War II that most people know. It has heroes and villains arranged in a way that makes moral sense. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end that feels earned. The good side won, the bad side lost. The world moved forward. That version is not false exactly, but it is incomplete in ways that matter, in ways that were carefully managed, in ways that required active decisions by governments, military institutions, journalists, and historians to sustain. The version most people know required things to be left out, not accidentally, not because they were unimportant, but because including them would have complicated a story that powerful institutions needed to remain simple. What actually happened during World War II was something more bureaucratic, more procedural, and in many ways more disturbing than the version that survived into public memory. The war was not primarily a conflict of dramatic moments and moral clarity. It was a conflict of forms, of signatures, of operational orders, of supply chains, of quotas, and of institutional processes that continued functioning even when what they were processing was human life. The machinery did not stop because someone felt something. The machinery rarely had feelings built into its design. The reports that came out of that war, the ones filed by officers, by doctors, by intelligence analysts, by military investigators, by civilian administrators, by the people whose job it was to document what was happening, those reports did not always match the story that emerged afterward. Some were reclassified, some were destroyed, some were quietly buried under layers of bureaucratic inaction. Some survived in archives that nobody visited for decades. And when they were finally read, what they described was not the war that had been publicly commemorated. What they described was a war that functioned efficiently while committing moral collapse at scale. This is not a story about monsters. Monsters would have been easier to manage, easier to contain, easier to explain. This is a story about systems, about how systems process instructions, about how ordinary people inside those systems performed extraordinary violence with procedural calm, about how the paperwork kept getting filed even when what it documented was the organized destruction of human beings, about how the most disturbing thing was never the chaos, it was always the order. The first thing that needs to be understood is that the Allied powers entered the war with their own forms of institutional violence already operating. The British Empire controlled roughly a quarter of the world's land surface through systems of coercion, extraction, and deliberate underdevelopment that had been running for centuries. The United States maintained a racial apartheid system within its own borders that shaped how the war was fought, who fought in it, and what rights soldiers were told they were defending. The Soviet Union had already executed hundreds of thousands of its own citizens through administrative processes that bore a disturbing structural resemblance to what the Nazis would later do in the East. None of this cancels anything. None of this creates a false equivalence. But it does mean that the war was not fought by pure actors against corrupt ones. It was fought by impure systems against other impure systems, and the record of what those systems actually did was never fully open to public view. One of the earliest suppressed realities of the war concerned what happened in Bengal in 1943. A famine broke out in the Bengal province of British India that killed somewhere between 2 and 3 million people. The famine was not entirely a natural event. It was shaped and accelerated by British wartime policy decisions. Rice exports continued from the region even as people starved. The colonial administration restricted internal food movement to prevent supplies from falling into Japanese hands if an invasion occurred. Winston Churchill, when informed of the famine, made remarks about Indians that were later described by those present as expressing something between indifference and contempt. The official wartime British reports on Bengal were not designed to establish accountability. They were designed to manage the narrative. The question of whether deliberate policy decisions caused preventable mass death was not a question that wartime British institutions were equipped to answer honestly about themselves. The Bengal famine of 1943 remained largely absent from Western accounts of the war for decades. It did not fit the story. It was not filed under the category of atrocity. It was filed under the category of wartime administrative difficulty, which is a different category with different implications. In the Pacific Theater, American military and intelligence reports about the use of poison gas require careful attention. The United States entered the war committed, at least publicly, to not using chemical weapons as a first strike policy. What those reports reveal is a considerably more complex picture. The American military stockpiled enormous quantities of chemical weapons in the Pacific. Mustard agent, phosgene, lewisite. Ships carried these weapons forward into the combat zone. Planning documents drafted by military staff considered scenarios in which chemical weapons would be used against Japanese cities and military positions. Some of those planning documents were quite specific. They named targets. They estimated casualty figures. They assessed logistical requirements for delivery. After the war, when the decision not to use chemical weapons was publicly celebrated as evidence of restraint, the planning documents that showed how close that decision had come to going the other way were classified and kept out of the historical record for decades. The restraint was real. The planning was also real. Both things were true simultaneously, and the institutional preference was to remember only one of them. The firebombing campaign against Japanese cities represents one of the most thoroughly documented, yet least publicly examined episodes of the war. General Curtis LeMay oversaw an operational shift in early 1945 that converted American bombing raids over Japan from high-altitude precision bombing to low-altitude incendiary attacks targeting urban residential areas. The reasoning was partly practical. High-altitude precision bombing had not been producing decisive results. Japanese industry was dispersed throughout urban areas. Residential neighborhoods surrounding factories were identified as legitimate targets under a logic that was carefully worked out in planning documents and operational orders. The March 9th and 10th raid on Tokyo in 1945 killed somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 people in a single night. The city burned. The Sumida River was clogged with bodies. Survivors described the canal water boiling. The operational report filed after that raid described it as a success. It used language about bomb damage assessment and target destruction and operational effectiveness. The human dimension was present in the report primarily as a category of enemy casualties, which is a different thing than what it was, which was the largest single-night killing of civilians in American military history at that point. The reports existed. The numbers existed. The operational language that surrounded those numbers was designed to make them processable within an institutional framework, and that framework continued processing them without stopping. There is a body of American military reporting from the Pacific that dealt specifically with the question of enemy remains. Marines and soldiers collected Japanese skulls, teeth, ears, and other body parts as trophies throughout the Pacific campaign. This was not a peripheral phenomenon. It was widespread enough that the military command felt compelled to issue orders against it on multiple occasions. A photograph of a young American woman sitting at a desk writing a letter to a serviceman with a Japanese skull on the desk in front of her was published in a popular American magazine in 1944. The photograph did not cause a major public scandal. Military reports from the Pacific documented the practice in operational terms, primarily because of concerns about operational security and the effect on enemy willingness to surrender. Japanese soldiers who believed they would be mutilated after death were considered less likely to give up. The reports were filed. The practice continued. After the war, the systematic collection of these records was not followed by a systematic public accounting. The practice was allowed to recede into a category of wartime excess rather than be examined as a question of institutional failure and racial dehumanization. Unit 731 of the Imperial Japanese Army conducted biological and chemical weapons experiments on human subjects in Manchuria throughout the war. The victims were primarily Chinese civilians and prisoners of war, along with Soviet, Korean, and other captives. The experiments were conducted with scientific notation, with procedural documentation, with the vocabulary and methodology of legitimate medical research applied to acts that killed thousands of people through deliberate infection, vivisection, pressure chamber experiments, frostbite studies, and weapons testing on living human beings. When the war ended, American intelligence officers made a decision that was documented in internal reports and has since become one of the most thoroughly confirmed suppressions of the post-war period. The scientists who ran Unit 731, including its commanding officer Shiro Ishii, were offered immunity from prosecution at the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunals in exchange for their research data. The deal was made. The immunity was granted. The data was transferred. The men who had conducted experiments on living human beings walked away from the war without prosecution, because what they had learned about how human bodies responded to biological agents was considered more valuable than accountability. The reports documenting this arrangement were classified. The decision was made by American authorities that the information had strategic value that outweighed the requirements of the Nuremberg principles that American prosecutors had simultaneously established for German war criminals. Both things were happening at the same time. The same institutional apparatus that was prosecuting German doctors at Nuremberg for conducting experiments on human beings was protecting Japanese doctors who had done the same things, because the Americans wanted their data. The reports about this arrangement did not become publicly available for decades. The occupation of Germany after the war produced a vast bureaucratic infrastructure dedicated to denazification, to identifying former members of the Nazi Party and removing them from positions of authority in the new German state. The reports generated by this process, by the Allied Control Council, by the various occupation authorities, by the Counterintelligence Corps of the United States Army, reveals something that the public narrative of the post-war period did not accommodate easily. The denazification program was incomplete by design almost from the beginning. It was not that administrators were unaware of how many former Nazis remained in positions of authority in West German government, industry, the judiciary, and the intelligence services. They were aware. The reports documented it. What changed was the assessment of what that meant strategically. The Soviet threat, as American and British planners understood it by 1947 and 1948, required a stable and functional West Germany more urgently than it required a thoroughly denazified West Germany. The decision to allow former Nazi officials to remain in their positions, to have their records cleared or their files buried, was made procedurally, through the same bureaucratic machinery that had been created to identify them. Forms were filled out. Assessments were made. Decisions were recorded in documents that noted the subject's former affiliation and then proceeded to certify them for continued service. The reports that documented how this happened were available in archives but were not subjects of official public accounting. Reinhard Gehlen was the chief of Wehrmacht intelligence on the Eastern Front during the war. He was also, by the war's end, in possession of an enormous archive of intelligence on Soviet military and political capabilities. He surrendered to American forces in 1945 with those files, and with an offer. He would provide the American intelligence services with his network and his expertise on the Soviet Union in exchange for protection for himself and his former officers, many of whom had been directly involved in operations that had resulted in the deaths of large numbers of Soviet civilians and prisoners of war. The Americans accepted. The Gehlen Organization, as it became known, was funded by American intelligence, staffed by former Nazi intelligence officers, some of whom had personally participated in war crimes, and operated throughout the early Cold War period, gathering intelligence on the Soviet bloc. This was not a secret within the American government. It was documented in internal reports. The decision was made explicitly and recorded. The argument was that the intelligence value was too high to refuse. The fact that some of the men involved had blood on their hands from the Eastern Front was weighed against the intelligence requirements of the new confrontation with the Soviet Union, and the decision came out on the side of the intelligence requirements. The Gehlen organization eventually became the nucleus of the West German Foreign Intelligence Service. The reports documenting its origins and the decisions that created it remained classified for a very long time. What happened to Soviet prisoners of war in German captivity is a chapter of the war that was suppressed by multiple institutions for different reasons simultaneously. The German military and government suppressed it because it was evidence of systematic murder. The Soviet government suppressed it because millions of Soviet prisoners had surrendered, and surrender was treated by Stalinist ideology as an act of cowardice or betrayal. The Western Allied powers suppressed it or minimized it because the scale of what happened to Soviet prisoners existed at a level that complicated the narrative of Nazi uniqueness, and also because discussing Soviet suffering too loudly during the early Cold War period was not strategically convenient. The numbers are difficult to establish precisely, which is itself part of the suppression. Somewhere between 3.5 million and more than 5 million Soviet prisoners of war died in German captivity between 1941 and 1945. They were shot outright, worked to death, starved deliberately, left in open-air camps in the Russian winter without adequate shelter, denied the protections of the Geneva Convention by a German military command that had made a formal decision early in the war that those protections did not apply on the Eastern Front. German military records documenting this decision, documenting the death rates, documenting the operational orders that created these conditions, survived the war. They went into archives. For a long time, they were not among the documents that the public narrative of the war centered. The rape and sexual violence committed by advancing Soviet forces in Germany and in German-occupied territories at the end of the war was documented in contemporary reports from multiple sources, including reports filed by Soviet military political officers who were responsible for monitoring troop behavior and morale. Estimates of the number of German women raped by Soviet soldiers in the closing phase of the war and in the immediate post-war period range widely, but credible historical estimates begin at hundreds of thousands and some place the number above 1 million. This was not invisible to Soviet command, it was documented. Political officers filed reports. Unit commanders filed reports. Some Soviet officers attempted to stop it. Looters and rapists were sometimes executed by their own command. But the institutional response was overwhelmingly one of tolerance, and in some documented cases encouragement, framed within a logic of retribution for what German forces had done in the Soviet Union. The Soviet government suppressed open discussion of these reports for decades. The West German and East German governments both had political reasons to manage how this chapter was publicly processed. The result was that millions of women who had experienced this violence lived in societies where the official record of what had happened to them was incomplete, contested, or simply absent from public discussion. The American military maintained a formal policy of racial segregation throughout the Second World War. African American soldiers served in segregated units, were assigned disproportionately to labor and support roles rather than combat, received inferior equipment and facilities, were excluded from certain theaters and operations, and were subjected to violence by white American soldiers and white American military police, both within the military and in the communities surrounding American military bases in the United States and abroad. Military reports documenting racial violence within the American military establishment were produced throughout the war. Courts, martial for racial incidents, generated documentation. Inspector General reports noted patterns. None of this was unknown to military leadership. The official response to racial violence within the military was primarily one of managing the incidents to prevent them from becoming public scandals or affecting morale, rather than one of identifying and addressing the systemic conditions that produced them. The reports existed. The institutional response was one of containment rather than accountability. After the war, the story of African American service during World War II was commemorated in ways that emphasized valor and contribution, while leaving the systematic nature of the discrimination and violence against those same soldiers under-examined in the public record. There is a body of documentation surrounding what happened at the Dachau concentration camp when American forces arrived in April 1945 that raises questions that were never fully answered through official channels. American troops of the 45th Infantry Division arrived at Dachau on April 29th. They found the camp in a state that, by any account, represented an extreme of documented human suffering. There were also documented incidents at Dachau on that day involving the killing of German SS guards, some of whom had already surrendered. American after-action reports and investigative documents produced in the days and weeks following the liberation addressed these incidents. Military investigations were opened. Witness statements were collected. The documentation that was produced indicated that a significant number of SS personnel were killed by American soldiers after the camp was in American hands. What happened to those investigations is itself a matter of record. They were essentially closed without court-martial proceedings. The commanding officer who oversaw the immediate aftermath at Dachau filed reports that described the situation in terms designed to manage the institutional and public implications rather than fully document what had occurred. The decision about what would be formally recorded and what would be allowed to remain in the uncertain territory between witness testimony and official documentation was made at the institutional level, and that decision shaped what survived into the historical record. Japanese-American incarceration during the war generated an enormous volume of government documentation. The War Relocation Authority, the War Department, the Department of Justice, and the White House all produced reports throughout the period of the incarceration. Some of those reports, produced by government officials while the incarceration was ongoing, raised serious legal and constitutional questions about what was being done. Reports produced by officials within the government noted that the military necessity argument being used to justify the incarceration was not well supported by the available intelligence. Reports from the Office of Naval Intelligence and from the Federal Bureau of Investigation both indicated that the Japanese-American population did not represent the kind of organized security threat that the incarceration was officially premised upon. Those reports were not prominently featured in the government's legal defense of the incarceration when it reached the Supreme Court. The case of Korematsu versus United States was decided in 1944, with the Supreme Court upholding the incarceration based in part on the government's representation of the national security situation. Decades later, when historical researchers examined the record, they found the suppressed reports. They found evidence that the government had withheld from the court intelligence assessments that contradicted the necessity argument. The legal cases were eventually retried in lower courts, and the convictions were vacated, but by that point, the constitutional precedent had already shaped American law for 40 years. The firebombing of Dresden in February 1945 produced casualty figures that were contested for decades, and that contest was not simply a matter of historical scholarship. It was a matter of institutional management. The immediate reports from the bombing estimated casualty figures at various levels. German propaganda immediately inflated the numbers enormously. Allied military authorities deflated them. After the war, the city was in East Germany, and the East German government had its own political reasons for managing how Dresden was commemorated and what numbers were officially endorsed. Western governments had reasons to resist the characterization of the Dresden bombing as an atrocity, because doing so would open questions about the moral calculus of the Allied bombing campaign more broadly. The result was that for decades, the actual casualty figure for Dresden, which historians now generally place somewhere between 22,000 and 25,000, was surrounded by a range of official and semi-official numbers that served various institutional interests and that were not primarily motivated by historical accuracy. The reports existed. The people who had access to them had reasons to select from them rather than synthesize them. Operation Paperclip was the American program to recruit German scientists and engineers after the war, including many who had been members of the Nazi Party and some who had used concentration camp labor and other forms of coerced human labor in their wartime work. The program was documented internally, reports were produced. The Army's Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, which administered the program, produced assessments of individual scientists that included notations about their Nazi Party membership, their SS rank where applicable, their involvement with concentration camp labor, and their potential intelligence value. In some cases, the reports recommended that certain scientists not be brought to the United States because their Nazi involvement was too direct and too well documented. In other cases, those recommendations were overridden at higher levels. Wernher von Braun, who became the most publicly prominent of the paperclip scientists and who was celebrated as a father of the American space program, had held an SS officer's rank and had been involved with the V-2 rocket program that used slave labor from the Dora concentration camp, where thousands of prisoners died in conditions that were in some respects worse than in other camps because the underground tunnel construction work was so lethal. The reports documenting this were produced by American military intelligence. They were classified. When von Braun was presented to the American public in the 1950s and 1960s as a visionary scientist and an American hero, the classified reports about his wartime history were not part of his public biography. The American Strategic Bombing Survey, conducted after the war in both Europe and the Pacific, produced one of the most comprehensive analyses of strategic bombing effectiveness in the historical record. The survey's conclusions, which were produced by a large team of analysts and which drew on extensive documentary and interview evidence, raised significant questions about the actual military effectiveness of the strategic bombing campaign. In Europe, the survey found that German industrial production had in some cases continued to increase despite bombing, that the bombing had been less decisive in ending the war than the bombing campaign's advocates had claimed, and that civilian morale, which was one of the stated targets of strategic bombing doctrine, had not collapsed in the way that the doctrine predicted it would. The survey's findings on the atomic bombings of Japan were similarly complex. The survey produced evidence suggesting that Japan was already on the path toward surrender before the atomic bombs were dropped, based on the conventional bombing campaign, the naval blockade, and the imminent Soviet entry into the Pacific War. These findings were politically uncomfortable because they complicated the official justification for the atomic bombings, which rested heavily on the argument that the bombs had been necessary to prevent an invasion that would have cost enormous numbers of lives on both sides. The survey reports were produced. They were available. They were not prominently featured in the official public accounting of why the war ended, when, and how it did. The treatment of German prisoners of war by American forces in the immediate aftermath of the war in Europe involves documentation that was suppressed, disputed, and remains contested. James Back, a Canadian author, argued in a 1989 book that American and French prisoner of war policy in the months following the German surrender resulted in deaths of enormous scale, with estimates he placed at nearly 1 million. The mainstream historical response challenged his methodology and his numbers significantly. What is less disputed is that conditions in American and French prisoner of war camps in the summer of 1945 were extremely harsh, that the reclassification of German prisoners from prisoners of war to disarmed enemy forces was done partly to remove them from the formal protections of the Geneva Convention, and that death rates in some camps during this period were significantly elevated compared to earlier periods of the war. American military reports from this period that addressed camp conditions and mortality rates were not comprehensively released into the public domain for decades. The precise scale of what happened remains a matter of historical dispute. What is clear is that the institutional management of the documentary record was not designed to facilitate a complete public accounting. The biological and chemical weapons program that the United States ran during World War II, centered at WWII Proving Ground in Utah and at other facilities, produced a level of organizational documentation that was almost entirely removed from public view for decades. American research and development of biological weapons during the war was conducted with institutional seriousness. Scientists worked on anthrax, on botulinum toxin, on other agents. Delivery systems were designed and tested. Operational planning was conducted. Reports were produced at every stage of this process. After the war, the existence of the American biological weapons program was not something the American government was prepared to discuss publicly, particularly given that American prosecutors at Nuremberg and Tokyo were simultaneously charging German and Japanese officials with crimes related to weapons of mass destruction and human experimentation. The reports from the American wartime biological weapons program were classified and remained classified. The American biological weapons program continued after the war and expanded during the Cold War, which is a separate history, but one that grew directly out of the institutional infrastructure that had been built during the war and that had been carefully kept out of the public record. The reports filed by American military chaplains during the war constitute a body of documentation that was never systematically compiled or publicly released, but that contains observations about the psychological and moral condition of American forces that complicate the public narrative of American wartime conduct. Chaplains were present with units throughout the war in all theaters. They were institutional observers of what soldiers actually experienced and what soldiers actually did. Their reports sometimes noted incidents of violence against prisoners, against civilians, against the dead of enemy forces that fell outside the categories of authorized military conduct. The chaplains were not prosecutors. Their role was pastoral and institutional. The reports they filed went into institutional channels and were not primarily designed to generate accountability. They were designed to inform command about morale and spiritual condition. But embedded in those reports were observations about what the war was actually doing to the people fighting it, and what the people fighting it were doing that were never aggregated into a public accounting. The role of American corporations in the economies of wartime Germany and occupied Europe is a chapter of the war that corporate and government institutions on both sides of the Atlantic worked very hard to leave unexamined after the war. American corporations including Ford, General Motors through its subsidiary Opel, IBM through its German subsidiary Dehomag, Standard Oil through its relationship with IG Farben, and others had business relationships with the Nazi economy that continued into the war years in various forms and through various mechanisms. Reports produced by the American government during and after the war that addressed these relationships were produced within bureaucratic frameworks that were not designed to lead to accountability for American corporations. The question of how American business interests had contributed to German industrial and military capacity was not one that the post-war American political economy was structured to answer honestly. Reports that addressed pieces of this question were produced, were filed, and were allowed to disappear into archives without generating the kind of public or legal reckoning that the evidence in some cases would have supported. The psychological and physiological effects of combat on American, British, Commonwealth, and other Allied soldiers were documented throughout the war in military, medical, and psychiatric reports that were classified and withheld from public view for reasons that were primarily about managing civilian morale and military recruitment rather than about protecting individual soldiers' privacy. Military psychiatrists produced reports throughout the war that documented what happened to men under sustained combat stress. The reports used clinical language, but what they described was the systematic destruction of psychological function in human beings exposed to prolonged violence. The rates of psychiatric breakdown were high enough that they represented a genuine operational problem for military command. The response to this problem at the institutional level was primarily one of management, of returning men to combat as quickly as possible, of minimizing the recognition of psychiatric breakdown as a legitimate medical condition rather than as a failure of will or character. The reports that documented the scale of psychiatric breakdown, the conditions that produced it, and the inadequacy of the medical response to it were not part of the public story of what the war had been. The public story needed soldiers who had gone through the war and come home capable of returning to civilian life. The reports described something considerably more complicated than that. There is a body of documentation from the liberation of the Nazi concentration camps that addresses what happened in the weeks and months after liberation that is less publicly examined than the liberation events themselves. The displaced persons problem that the end of the war created was enormous. Millions of people were alive in Europe who had no homes to return to, who were surviving in conditions of extreme deprivation, who were stateless in a legal and practical sense that the institutional frameworks of the post-war world were not equipped to address. Reports from displaced persons camps in the American and British zones of occupied Germany documented conditions that were in some cases not dramatically different from what liberated concentration camp survivors had experienced before liberation. People were housed in inadequate facilities, food was insufficient, medical care was overwhelmed. Jewish survivors of the concentration camps were in many cases housed alongside people who had collaborated with or participated in Nazi violence against them. The reports from American military and civilian officials who administered the displaced persons camps documented these conditions. Some officials were alarmed enough to write bluntly about what they were seeing. Those reports were received by a bureaucracy that was managing an enormous number of simultaneous crises, and that did not have the capacity or in some cases the institutional will to respond with the resources that the situation required. The reports documented the failure. The failure continued. The question of what happened to Nazi looted art and looted gold and other assets that were in German hands at the end of the war, and what happened to those assets in the post-war settlement, involves documentation that was systematically incomplete for reasons that served the interests of several governments simultaneously. American military reports on the recovery of Nazi looted gold and art were produced throughout the occupation period. What those reports documented was a recovery effort that was genuine, but that was also operating within a political and economic environment in which certain questions about the ultimate destination of recovered assets were difficult to ask and answer clearly. The Swiss banking system's role in holding Nazi gold, including gold that had been melted down from the possessions of murdered concentration camp victims, was documented in wartime intelligence reports. The political decision about what to do with that documentation after the war involved considerations that were not primarily about the victims. They involved considerations about Swiss neutrality, about the stability of European banking, about Cold War economic relationships. The reports that documented what the Swiss banks had held and where it had come from were not made part of the public record for decades. When they finally became the subject of investigation in the 1990s, the amounts involved and the nature of what had been held in Swiss accounts on behalf of the Nazi state were established by researchers working through archives that had been closed for 50 years. The Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, produced a body of documentation about Japanese wartime atrocities that was in some respects politically shaped by the requirements of the American occupation of Japan. The tribunal prosecuted Japanese leaders for crimes against peace, for conventional war crimes, and for crimes against humanity. The tribunal did not address the conduct of Unit 731. The tribunal did not address the atomic bombings. The Soviet judge on the tribunal dissented from the majority verdict and produced a minority opinion that ran to several hundred pages and that raised fundamental legal and evidentiary questions about the proceedings that the tribunal's institutional record did not engage with seriously. The dissenting opinion was not made publicly available in English for decades. The Indian judge on the tribunal, Radhabinod Pal, also dissented, arguing that the tribunal was victor's justice and that the Allies had not come to the proceedings with clean hands. The Pal dissent was likewise not prominently featured in the public accounting of the Tokyo trials. The majority verdicts were executed. The records that complicated those verdicts were managed in ways that left the official narrative intact. What happened after the war, in the years immediately following, was that governments on all sides made decisions about what would be remembered, what would be prosecuted, what would be buried, and what would be transformed. Those decisions were not made randomly. They were made through the same bureaucratic machinery that had administered the war. Forms were filled out. Committees were convened. Reports were commissioned and then classified. Individual careers were protected. Institutional reputations were managed. The vast machinery of documentation that the war had generated was processed through this post-war bureaucracy. And what emerged on the other side of that processing was a record that was partial, that was selected, and that served the institutional interests of the governments that controlled the archives. The soldiers who had seen what actually happened went home. Some of them talked, some of them did not. The ones who did not talk were not always protecting atrocities. Some of them simply could not find the language, or found that the language they had access to did not match what they had experienced, or found that the people they tried to talk to were not equipped to receive what they were trying to say. The gap between what had happened and what could be said about it in public was enormous, and that gap was not an accident. It was maintained by institutions that had reasons to maintain it. The war ended. The systems did not. The bureaucracies that had processed the war demobilized partially and reorganized. The intelligence services that had collected information about enemy capabilities reorganized to collect information about new enemies, often using the same people who had collected information during the war, including people whose wartime activities had not been examined. The military establishments that had developed and used weapons of enormous destructive capacity reorganized to develop and stockpile weapons of even greater capacity. The industrial complexes that had produced the material of war reorganized to produce the material of peace and of the new confrontation. The legal frameworks that had been established at Nuremberg to define crimes against humanity and to establish individual accountability for state violence were invoked selectively in the decades that followed, and were not invoked at all in some cases where the evidence would have supported their invocation. The archivists continued to file. The documents continued to accumulate. The gap between the record and the public narrative of what had happened continued to be maintained by the institutions that had created both. In 1945 and 1946, the British government produced internal reports analyzing what had occurred in Bengal during the 1943 famine. Those reports addressed questions of policy, of resource allocation, of administrative decision-making during the famine period. The reports were not published. They were filed. The question of institutional accountability for what had happened in Bengal was processed through a bureaucratic framework that was not designed to produce accountability, and it produced the expected result. The people who had made the decisions that shaped the famine were not prosecuted. The policies that had contributed to mass death were examined internally, and the examinations were classified. The public narrative of the war in Asia emphasized Japanese atrocities and Allied liberation, which were real, and did not prominently feature the question of what British administrative decisions had meant for the people of Bengal, which was also real. Both things were real simultaneously, and the selection of which real things would be publicly remembered was made by institutions with interests in the selection. The American Counterintelligence Corps, in the years following the war, produced an enormous volume of documentation about former Nazis who had been identified in the American occupation zone and in various European countries. Some of those reports recommended prosecution. Some of those reports recommended exclusion from positions of authority. Some of those reports were acted upon. A significant number of those reports were not acted upon, for reasons that were documented in follow-up correspondence and in the records of the various bureaucratic bodies that reviewed them. The reasons given were various. The individual in question had skills that were needed. The individual in question had information that was valuable. The individual in question had already been screened by a local denazification board and cleared, even if the Counterintelligence Corps had concerns about the accuracy of that clearance. The reports were filed. The decisions were recorded. The former Nazis remained in their positions. The reports documenting both the identification and the decision not to act were classified, and they remained classified while the individuals in question lived out their post-war careers in West German institutions, in American-sponsored research programs, in international organizations. Some of them died before the files were opened. Some of them did not. The question of what the American government knew about the Holocaust while it was occurring, and when it knew it, and what decisions were made in response to that knowledge, involves a body of documentation that was for a long time not part of the public record, and that is still not comprehensively public. Reports from American diplomatic sources in Europe describing the systematic killing of Jewish populations were reaching the State Department in 1942. By the end of 1942, the broad outlines of what was happening to European Jews were documented in reports available to senior American government officials. The response of the State Department to this information during the period from 1942 to 1944 involved bureaucratic actions that historians have characterized as suppression. Cables from American diplomats in Switzerland containing information about the killing were not forwarded to the relevant offices. Requests to publish information about the killing were delayed or blocked. The Treasury Department eventually forced the issue by producing its own report, a document known as the Report to the Secretary on the Acquiescence of this Government in the Murder of the Jews, which was produced in January 1944, and which used language that was blunt to the point of institutional alarm. The War Refugee Board was established in response to this pressure. But the years from 1942 to 1944, during which American diplomatic and intelligence reporting on the Holocaust was available within the government and was not the basis for significant American action, represent a period of institutional decision-making that was documented at the time and that has been gradually reconstructed from archival evidence, but that was not part of the public story of American involvement with the Holocaust for a very long time. The firebombing campaigns against German cities produced reports from the Royal Air Force Bomber Command and from the American 8th Air Force throughout the war that addressed both the operational effectiveness of the bombing and, in some cases, the question of civilian casualties. Arthur Harris, the head of RAF Bomber Command, was among the most direct in his views about what area bombing of German cities was intended to accomplish. His operational reports and his correspondence with the Air Ministry described the bombing in terms that did not obscure its civilian dimensions. After the war, the question of whether the strategic bombing of Germany constituted a war crime or a crime against humanity was raised in some quarters and dismissed in others. Harris, unlike many of the German officers who were prosecuted at Nuremberg, was not tried. He was not given a campaign medal, specifically for the bomber offensive, for reasons that were partly political and that reflected the discomfort of British governmental and military institutions with the full public accounting of what Bomber Command had done. The operational reports from Bomber Command that documented the scale of civilian casualties in German cities were available in the archives but were not prominently featured in the public commemoration of the air war over Europe. The records of what happened in the Soviet Union under German occupation between 1941 and 1944, the records of the Einsatzgruppen, of the mass shootings, of the destruction of Jewish and non-Jewish Soviet civilian populations, were collected after the war by the Nuremberg prosecutors from captured German documents and from witness testimony. Those records are among the most complete documentation of systematic mass killing that has ever been assembled for any event in human history. The perpetrators kept records. They filed reports. They sent cables. They noted the dates, the locations, and the numbers. The records survived because the Germans produced them in enormous quantities and because the collapse of the German state was too rapid to allow for comprehensive destruction of the documentary archive. What the records show, when read in aggregate, is a system of mass killing that was managed with bureaucratic normalcy. Commanders filed after-action reports. Quartermasters arranged logistics. Personnel officers tracked assignments and rotations. The paperwork of murder was filed alongside the paperwork of everything else, using the same forms, the same filing systems, the same administrative conventions. The Nuremberg tribunal used some of this evidence. Historians have used much more of it in the decades since. The full scope of what those records contain has still not been fully processed into public understanding. The Allied bombing of transportation infrastructure in occupied Western Europe in the lead-up to the Normandy invasion in 1944 killed large numbers of French, Belgian, and Dutch civilians. Allied planners knew before the bombing campaign began that it would produce significant civilian casualties in occupied European cities. Reports analyzing the expected civilian casualties were produced during the planning phase. The bombing proceeded. Estimates of French civilian deaths from Allied bombing during the war range from 50,000 to 60,000. This is not a figure that was prominently featured in the public commemoration of the liberation of Western Europe. It was documented in operational planning reports, in after-action assessments, in post-war surveys. It was known to the people who made the decisions. It was part of the institutional record. It was not part of the story that the liberated nations and their liberators needed to tell about what had happened. The treatment of colonial subjects who served in Allied forces, and the disparity between their treatment during the war, and the promises that were either explicitly or implicitly made about the relationship between their military service and the future of colonialism, represents a body of documentation that multiple governments had reasons to suppress or minimize. Indian soldiers served in enormous numbers in the British Army. African soldiers served in French forces. Soldiers from across the British Empire and the French colonial empire fought and died in a war that was publicly framed in terms of freedom, self-determination, and resistance to totalitarianism. Internal reports produced by British and French colonial administrators during and after the war documented the tension between the wartime rhetoric and the continued reality of colonial control. The demands for independence that followed the war in India, in Indochina, in Africa, in other parts of the colonial world, were not surprises to the colonial administrators. They were anticipated and documented in internal reports. The response of the colonial powers to those demands involved, in various cases, military violence that was in some instances of a scale and character that was documented in internal reports and that was not publicly acknowledged. The French suppression of the Sétif uprising in Algeria in May 1945, which occurred while the celebrations of victory in Europe were still continuing, killed large numbers of Algerians and was addressed in French military and administrative reports in ways that minimized and obscured the scale and nature of what had happened. The question of what actually happened in the final months of the Pacific War between the June 1945 Battle of Okinawa and the Japanese surrender in August 1945 involves a body of American intelligence reporting that complicated the post-war official account of why the atomic bombs were used and why they were necessary. American intelligence assessments from this period documented the state of Japanese military capability and Japanese government deliberations about ending the war. The assessments indicated awareness within the Japanese government of the need to end the war. They documented the role that Japanese attempts to negotiate through the Soviet Union before the Soviet entry into the Pacific War played in Japanese strategic thinking. The intercepts of Japanese diplomatic communications that the American code-breaking program had been producing throughout the war continued to be produced during this period and gave American leadership considerable insight into Japanese government deliberations. The relationship between what American leadership knew from these intelligence assessments and the decisions that were made about the atomic bombings was not a simple one, and the documentation supporting a complete analysis of that relationship remained classified for decades. When historians began to gain access to these records, the official account of the decision to use atomic weapons became more complicated, and the institutional management of what the documentation actually showed became a subject of scholarly dispute that has not been fully resolved. The war crimes committed by American soldiers in the European theater of operations were investigated by the Judge Advocate General's Department of the United States Army throughout the war and in the immediate post-war period. The volume of investigations and the outcomes of those investigations represent a body of documentation that was never systematically compiled into a public report. Individual cases were tried. Individual soldiers were convicted and in some cases executed. But the aggregate picture of what those cases represented, of how widespread certain categories of conduct were, of what conditions produced them, and what command failures allowed them, was not assembled from the institutional record and presented publicly. The reports existed in individual case files. The aggregate remained unassembled. The institutional preference was to treat each incident as individual rather than to examine the pattern that the incidents collectively represented. The chemical weapons testing that the British and American militaries conducted on their own soldiers during the war, using mustard agent and other chemical compounds to study their effects on human skin and respiratory systems, was documented in medical and experimental reports that were classified after the war. Thousands of soldiers in both the American and British militaries were exposed to chemical agents in experimental conditions without full informed consent, using standards of disclosure that ranged from inadequate to non-existent. The reports documenting these experiments were classified. Veterans who had been exposed often did not know what they had been exposed to. When they experienced long-term health effects and sought medical care or disability benefits, the classified nature of the experiments made it difficult or impossible for them to establish what had happened to them. The reports that documented their exposure existed in classified archives, while those veterans navigated a medical and benefit system that did not have access to the information that would have explained their conditions. The British government's response to the discovery of what had happened in the Nazi concentration camps during the liberation period produced internal documentation that addressed questions of policy and communication that were managed carefully. Film footage of the liberation of the camps was edited and produced under government supervision for public release. Decisions were made about what would be shown and how it would be framed. Reports on the condition of survivors addressed medical and logistical questions in institutional language. The political and policy implications of what had been discovered, including questions about what had been known and when, about what responses had been possible and had not been taken, were processed through institutional channels that were not designed to produce public accountability. The public was given the visual evidence, the institutional record of what had been known before liberation, and what had and had not been done in response to that knowledge was processed through channels that did not lead to public examination. The post-war fate of the Waffen-SS veterans who survived the war represents a chapter of institutional management that was handled differently in different national contexts, and that in each context reflected institutional interests more than consistent principles. Former Waffen-SS soldiers were initially excluded from the post-war West German military establishment that was being built under American oversight to provide a West German contribution to NATO. As the requirements of the Cold War created pressure to build West German military capability as quickly as possible, the question of how to handle former Waffen-SS veterans who had military experience that was needed was processed through bureaucratic mechanisms that in many cases resulted in their integration into the new West German Bundeswehr. Reports were produced assessing individual veterans. Assessments were made of their wartime service. Determinations were made about which units and which activities were considered crimes and which were considered conventional military service. Those determinations were institutional decisions with consequences, and they were made through processes that were documented, but that were not publicly examined in any comprehensive way. The records of what happened to the millions of ethnic Germans who were expelled from Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and other Eastern European countries at the end of the war and in the immediate post-war period represent one of the largest forced population movements in European history. The expulsions were authorized by the Potsdam Agreement. They were carried out by the governments of the countries from which the Germans were expelled, with the knowledge and in some cases the explicit approval of the Allied powers. Internal reports produced by Allied occupation authorities and by the governments carrying out the expulsions documented conditions that in many cases involved extreme violence, inadequate provisions, significant mortality, and human rights abuses, of a character that bore uncomfortable resemblance to the categories of conduct that were simultaneously being prosecuted at Nuremberg. The reports were produced. They were filed. The institutional processing of what they documented did not result in prosecution or in public accountability. The expulsions were framed as a necessary consequence of the war that Germany had started, which was a frame that served the institutional interests of the governments involved, and that did not require engagement with what the reports about the conditions of the expulsions actually described. By the time the war was over and the immediate post-war settlements had been made, a vast machinery of documentation had been produced and then processed through institutional channels that determined what would survive into public memory and what would be buried, classified, destroyed, or simply left in archives where the probability of anyone finding it approached zero for practical purposes. The machinery that made those determinations was the same machinery that had administered the war. The same bureaucratic logic that had made violence routine during the war made institutional self-protection routine afterward. The forms continued to be filed, the signatures continued to be collected, the classifications continued to be stamped, the files continued to be closed. The war ended in August 1945 with the surrender ceremonies on the deck of the USS Missouri, and the reporting on those ceremonies was published in newspapers around the world. And the photographs were distributed, and the public narrative of the war's end was established through those images and those reports. The other reports, the ones that described what the war had actually been, continued to accumulate in archives where they were processed by the same institutional machinery that had produced them, and the gap between those reports and the public narrative of what had happened was maintained by that machinery for as long as the machinery found it useful to maintain it, and in some cases longer than that.